Welcome, everyone, to Euromonitor International's Fashion Friday podcast series. My name is Peter Cosmo, and I'm in the communications department here at Euromonitor. And joining me today is Kayla Villena, consultant here at Euromonitor International. Kayla, how are you doing today?
Hi, I'm doing well. Thanks for having me, Peter.
Good, I'm glad to hear it. So today I wanted to talk about sustainability and how it fits into the broader world of beauty and personal care. Can you kind of give us an introduction on that?
Yeah, of course. Sustainability is a very big topic right now. When we think about sustainability, we often think about reducing environmental impact. So, out of sustainability's three pillars, the first being economic, then environmental, and third social, much of the beauty industry's innovation has centered around the environmental pillar. But in today's Fashion Friday podcast, I'll not only discuss innovation in that aspect, but also purpose over profit, which is a more holistic approach that aims to encompass social, environmental, and economic value with sustainability. In an earlier episode last May, I spoke a little bit about sustainability in beauty, but focusing on beauty brand strategies to minimize waste and minimize energy that went into ingredient sourcing. At that time, I also predicted that while sustainability efforts took a back seat during the immediate outbreak of the COVID-19 pandemic, the momentum for sustainability will likely accelerate due to consumers forming new habits during lockdown and post lockdown phases. And that's something that we're starting to see take place now. Almost a year later, we can see that momentum in sustainability is picking back up again. It's also coinciding with greater strides in vaccine distribution, the reopening of marketplaces, and more optimism for future economic recovery.
Yeah, I feel like we've talked a lot. At least I've talked a lot in this podcast series about sustainability and how, consumers are a little bit more focused on sustainability, environmentalism. As you know, we could see the effects of people not going to work, commuting as much on the environment. I'm curious to hear about the focal points of sustainability for beauty and personal care players.
Exactly. You're exactly correct. That is, I think, part of the consciousness that consumers have adopted when they start to see how much they really do impact the environment and how that has changed the course of the environment now that their impact isn't as pronounced. So, one of the very interesting aspects of sustainability that I'm very interested in, and it's fascinating for me to watch, is how refillable packaging is changing. For many years, refillable packaging has been an area that industry sources are saying is where the innovation is. It's will reinvent the supply chain. I think those aspects are still true, but I think there's a timeline in order for us to get there. So refillable packaging is definitely gaining traction among different types of players. And this is really interesting to see because what we've typically seen in the beauty industry is that the smaller indie or niche brands will latch on to a type of innovation and then it spreads to the mainstream brands. With refillable packaging, that innovation has come from your small indie players, it's come from your mid-sized companies, and even your multinational CPG firms. And so that's great because momentum is from all aspects of different beauty company types. It's not new by any means. The bulk refill format has been around for quite some time. We remember this in liquid soaps, but it has also entered other categories like deodorants, cosmetics, and fragrances because it really does help reduce packaging waste and shipping costs. Some recent innovations include Dove, who launched a refillable deodorant and coming off the heels of some refillable cartridges from other indie players. And I think what's really interesting is when we see other categories get involved, we look to fragrances, which is usually a category that's typically more focused on emotional connections rather than sustainable consciousness. And even in this category, they've had some innovation through refill stations, but also removable or unscrewable lids that make refills possible, or the product packaging to be more apt for recycling.
Yeah, it's interesting you mentioned those indie brands. I feel like I've seen a lot of ads like on Instagram for different beauty players, or something like home care where it's, you drop a tablet into a plastic container and it, fills it with cleaner or something like that. I feel like I'm seeing those all the time. So I'm wondering how you see refillable packaging changing in the future. Do you think it's going to be more mainstream in beauty?
Yeah, well, I think refillable packaging is great because there's a couple of different angles that you can approach it with. And when we're talking about refillable packaging, certain regions or certain consumers are a little closer to different angles than others. So, for example, certain consumers are still really new to the idea of refillable packaging. So, in Western Europe, there are consumers there who are much more eco-conscious about the environment. And so that's a market where we're already seeing refill stations in retailers like
Hmm.
Asda, The Body Shop, and Neil's Yard Remedies. And you contrast that to consumers in the US who are actually still getting used to the idea of bringing their reusable bags to the grocery store. So in this market, bulk refills and flexible plastic, for example, will more likely be an introductory step for refills before the consumer is ever ready for refillable cartridges or pods. And those things we're seeing in categories like lipsticks, makeup, and skincare. But I think it will take some time. And when we think about the consumers that are ready for refills, who will be the first adopters? Many times these are your younger consumers, your
Mhm.
millennials, your Gen Z, but also those who are more focused on categories that really care about having these ethical claims like skincare and color cosmetics. We kind of see an overlap between claims of cruelty free, vegan, a lot of clean beauty claims, really heavily leveraging the angle of sustainability in the ingredient sourcing and then bringing the environmental aspect of that to the forefront.
Sure.
And we know that in the US, we're still at the beginning of that, right? So Ulta Beauty just announced a partnership with TerraCycle's Loop. And I imagine that over time, circularity will be a bigger part of the beauty consumer experience, but it will take some time to get there. And consumer adoption, I think, is one of the biggest hurdles, even though the technology really does exist there for the manufacturers and the different players in the beauty supply chain. Second, I also think refillable packaging in beauty will become a bigger deal or become more mainstream once circularity in the packaged foods section and grocery spaces become mainstream. So, when we look at what's happened with the clean beauty trends and naturals, we can typically see that beauty is the next industry to be influenced by those trends that first happen in foods. We saw that with the gluten free claims, we saw that with vegan claims. So, I think refillable packaging will be one of those areas where it may have to take off first in the food space
Sure.
so that consumers can get used to it and become accustomed to it once it happens in the beauty space to a higher frequency.
We talked just a little bit earlier about consumers kind of becoming more aware of their environmental impact and it kind of being a major focus of sustainability as a whole. So, what other innovations have you kind of seen over the past year as COVID played out?
For sure, when COVID happened, we saw the a lot of pressures on the supply chain, whether that be logistics, the sourcing of raw materials. And so even brands before that were paying close attention to that. I feel like that's been a major part of their decision making in the future because we saw what happened when the supply chain broke down a little bit. So right now, more brands are exploring alternative packaging materials, mainly because they're looking for alternatives to virgin plastic, which is the most widely used packaging type in beauty. PCR is a big focus right now, so post consumer recycled content, as are bio and plant based formats. And some of those formats include sugarcane,
Hmm.
cork, and bamboo. I've also seen some beauty players come out with alternatives that use egg carton packaging and also mycelium, which is the roots of mushrooms, as other alternatives. What I'm looking forward to seeing is this interesting pivot in how beauty brands are using waste and even byproducts. So, not only making them purposeful for the packaging, but also for the formulation. One example that comes to mind is when L'Oreal partnered with LanzaTech and Total, and they developed packaging made from captured and recycled carbon emissions. And so I think what's really great about that is that hadn't really been done before in beauty. So that innovation made it possible for more opportunities to reuse those carbon emissions, which we know are contributing to changes in our environment. I also recently read that the peels of lychee have been found to have brightening benefits when it's in an extract form. And so lychee is a fruit that is typically native to Southeast Asia, and you usually peel the pink reddish outside when you're eating it or when you're preparing it for a canned format. But I think what's interesting is that these lockdown measures, this pandemic has made consumers more aware of their environment, and that really sets the stage for other areas of environmental sustainability like using food waste, zero waste packaging, reusing plastic found in oceans, and also some water efficient and water free formulas. So it's great that with sustainability, there's so many different aspects you can look at and find one that works best for your brand and that resonates with your consumers.
Yeah, it really sounds like a lot of beauty players have a more of a grip on the environmental pillar of sustainability than almost anything else.
Yeah, I'd say that's correct. And a lot of factors went into that, especially with major players announcing sustainability goals and timelines, several years ago. So I'd say that having those conversations years ago really helped bring out the momentum at the same time while the consumer is catching up with the environmental consciousness and seeking brands that fit their ethos. So yeah, I'd say that that's been a focus for a while now among the beauty brands.
So one thing that we talk about a lot when we talk about sustainability is this idea of businesses going from profit to purpose, or we call it purpose over profit. So I'm curious to see how this purpose over profit fits into the broader beauty and personal care market.
Yeah, and that's a great question because we're starting to see that really pop up, especially after a year into the pandemic. I think what's important to understand is that different players define sustainability in different ways. So, Euromonitor did a survey in 2020, the Voice of the Industry Sustainability Survey, and we talked to different players in the beauty supply chain. So, we talked to manufacturers, we talked to retailers, packaging players, and what we found is that different players of that supply chain they all think about sustainability in different ways, and this makes sense because their roles are different.
Sure.
But I think what was interesting was that the discrepancies were biggest in certain variables, specifically supporting local communities, supporting employees, and being a purpose driven business. And those three facets all play into this idea of purpose driven components of sustainability. And I think that's interesting to see that that hasn't been fully developed or fully flushed out to the extent that the environmental impact variables have. But I think now that we've seen what's happened over the past year, the pandemic has really brought on a new consciousness that goes beyond merely compensating for a company's negative impact on people and the planet. It actually laid bare a humanitarian crisis, which we've seen through the higher demand at food banks across multiple parts of the country and other regions.
Sure.
And I think this also makes it slightly different from the effect that the financial crisis had on consumers a decade ago. So, taking all of that into account, when we think about people over profit, there's a lot of changes that happen, and the way that companies are including that in their mission is going to look different than how they've done it in the past.
Yeah. So when we think about people over profit, how does this kind of fit in with beauty and personal care companies?
Well, I think one category that's had a lot of innovation, we saw this in clean beauty, we saw this in the naturals trend, uh, is skincare. This has been a category where the consumers, generally speaking, tend to be more conscious about those other factors beyond, the efficacy of the product. So it's been more pronounced in skincare categories, and that consciousness, that ethos really emanated to other categories. But where I think I see a change is that this people over profit angle momentum has also been increasing in other personal care categories. we have a few examples that we've seen over the past year. Old Spice, for example, highlighted the impact of COVID-19 on minority communities. And early on, they partnered with BT for a relief fund effort. Gillette was also one of the other beauty personal care brands that donated masks and sanitizers. And other essentials to healthcare institutions and healthcare workers. But I think what's interesting is most recently they launched Planet Kind, which is a shaving and skincare line that has sustainability written all over it. It has recyclable packaging made from recycled paper, recycled plastic, recyclable aluminum. They're also introducing some cause marketing. So they partner with a plastic bank so that every purchase uh, goes into preventing 10 plastic bottles from entering the ocean. We also saw this with other smaller brands. For example, Bravo Sierra is a US brand that actually also has cause marketing. It contributes 5% of its sales to morale, welfare, and recreation, which is an entity that offers community support programs to US service members, veterans, and their families. And so Bravo Sierra has partnered with that company to have a testing program in which 1,000 of active duty US military members use the products, they give feedback in the development stage, and they help contribute to the beauty participation process. And what's interesting when we think about all these other initiatives, and there's so many, right? There's so many. Uh, they're very widespread and they span a lot of different aspects. But I'd say that the overall consensus, and based on the survey data that we're also seeing, suggests that consumers are increasingly holding companies accountable to care for the communities. And that certainly has accelerated during the pandemic. And I believe that will be a mainstay feature afterwards in sustainability.
Yeah, Caleb, first of all, I want to thank you for everything you've said. And I kind of want to leave with this thought. Um, COVID-19 obviously was a huge worldwide crisis, and I don't want to minimize the terrible effects that it had on everyone across the globe. But one thing I do want to kind of touch on is the fact that it brought out a lot of humanitarian efforts from companies and people, and really did get a lot of people to focus on environmentalism, on sustainability, and kind of how we can treat both planet and people better in the future. And it's going to be interesting to see how companies keep this up going forward.
I think one of the reasons for that increased consciousness is that consumers just have a lot of more time on their hands. I'd say that overall, time spent on social media, time spent on devices has really gone up among a lot of consumers globally. And so that has given them more time to learn about these issues or um, be a little smarter or more savvy and learn more about the companies who are making strides in
Hmm.
these areas of sustainabilities. So I think the consumer empowerment piece will help bring the momentum forward. I also think that the demand from consumers has caused brands to make changes to their formulation, and in turn it's putting leverage on retailers to then set certain sustainable criteria for their brands to follow. We see this with certain beauty specialist retailers in the UK and the US who have rankings of brands, and they have their own labels where they highlight brands that fit a certain criteria or highlight brands that have changed from uh, plastic to, say, a virgin plastic alternative. And so the retailers are also becoming an increasingly bigger part of the conversation to consumers to say, this is what we care about. These are the brands that we're presenting to you. And here is how they are all moving us forward. And I think that's been an important change because now retailers are putting leverage on those brands to adapt. And I think we'll start to see that more, and that will trickle down to other parts of the supply chain. But again, as I said earlier, it will take time, but we're starting to see that momentum really happen in markets like Western Europe and increasingly so in North America. But I still think there's more room for that innovation and that white space in other really fast growing beauty markets like Asia Pacific. So I think we'll start to see innovation happen a little differently in different markets because the needs of the consumers and their habits are a bit different. But I do believe we're heading in the right space, in the right direction. I just believe that it'll take time and it won't happen overnight, but we're off to a good start, I'd say.
That's good. That's good. It's something we'll have to keep our eye on, and I'm sure we'll have you back in the next couple months so we can talk about even more innovations. So,
Yeah, of course. I look forward to it.
well, thank you for joining us today, and thank you to our audience for tuning in to this Fashion Friday podcast. Remember, you can find all of our multimedia over on our blog at blog.euromonitor.com.